Hello, and welcome to the History of Ceramics. I'm Stephanie Rosine.
And I'm Paul Greenhouse. And this week we're going to look at the career of a single seminal individual, Bernard Leach.
So we're going to be spending 3 episodes with dear Bernard. And we're going to be diving into his life, his career, the impact that he had not only in Britain, where he's a giant, but also his impact, I think, across Europe and certainly across North America. Leach, he championed this new way of making ceramics that influenced multiple generations. And while I don't think we could say he's the first or the greatest in sort of purely aesthetic terms. He was a passionate champion, an intellectual and a writer, teacher, and entrepreneur of the ceramic arts.
I couldn't agree more. I would say one of the interesting things, he's first in virtually nothing, I would say, across the range of his career, but incredibly important in a number of areas. When he died in 1979 at the age of 92, so a wonderful innings, he had an obituary in the Times. Now, we must put that in context. Very rare a potter would be in the Times for an obituary, so it shows the status he'd come to enjoy. And the writer of the obituary says that he's a greater influence on potting,
yep,
than anybody since Josiah Wedgwood in the 18th century. So he compares him to the only other figure, perhaps in the world of ceramics in UK, but perhaps in many places, who is almost a household name, Josiah Wedgwood and the Wedgwood Company. And the obituary goes on to say that he inspired a renaissance of the craft. So he led a transformation.
Yeah. And he also creates a space that allowed other ceramic artists to have careers that flourish, careers like mine in many ways. And he is perhaps most well known by makers for his 1940 publication of A Potter's Book. And that really was one of the first texts that elevated the status of the maker through writing. And he wrote this beautiful passage: "The potter is no longer a peasant or a journeyman, as in the past, nor can he be any longer described as an industrial worker. He is by force of circumstance an artist craftsman, working for the most part alone." So he believed that this idea of the artist craftsman was the chief means of defense against materialism of industry, he wrote, and its insensibility to beauty.
Yeah. In that sense, perhaps, and it's we come back, he politicized
He did.
ceramic in some way, very powerfully so. And I find it so interesting that, a maker really coming from very different perspective in your own work, but still nevertheless you think he's there casting a shadow.
Well, and if you look at the lineage of my teachers, I'm his great-granddaughter.
Now there's something to think about.
And I think we're going to get into that.
Yeah, his influence on generations, which made him controversial at times and had many people fighting and arguing about his intellectual position with regard to ceramic. Nevertheless, a giant.
So today, this is the first part of the story of Bernard Leach. So, Paul, I think we should start this story by taking a look at where he came from.
Quite a shaky start, a complicated start. He was born in Hong Kong, but his mother, Eleanor, died giving birth to Bernard. So initially he was brought up by his grandparents in Japan until he was 4. So very early on, introduced to that as a very small child. And then he went back to Hong Kong in 1891 to live with his father, Andrew. Now, Andrew was a colonial barrister, so quite important to actually begin to situate ourselves in what life was like as a little boy.
Right. And I'll just, for anyone out there who's not part of the British Empire, a barrister is a lawyer, yes. Yes. So he's born into this sort of typical colonial world of upper class and money, perhaps. Do you think that those kind of structures and systems affected his way of thinking?
Without any doubt, I would say so. And we would say not super wealth, but upper middle class. And the upper middle class who ran the British Empire, and a barrister, a solicitor, a legal figure concerned with the governance of Hong Kong and British relations in the Near East. So right in the kind of eye of the storm, if you like, of late British Empire. Edmund de Waal, one of our leading ceramic artists, but one of our great writers who's written on Bernard and knew the family, says this: he was raised in a conventional colonial world, and his prospects as a young man were similarly predictable. Bernard was never going to be an artist in his father's eyes. He was going to follow down this highly lucrative British imperial professional life. So at the age of 10, obviously, he was sent back to England to be educated. 10, a little boy, traveling around the world, and prepared for a career in banking.
How exciting for him.
Very exciting. But pretty early on, and I think his grandparents got something to do with this. They were looser and more creative, perhaps. His real loves start to come out. And his dad, Andrew, by all means, from what we can pick up, a nice man, was persuaded to let his boy go to the Slade School of Art, which was one of London's leading schools and is still there. So he enrolled in 1903, and it was taught by an extraordinary character, a painter called Henry Tonks. And Henry Tonks, very liberal, very open. So for the first time in his life, Bernard sees another world. It opens up into another idea of what life might be.
And I can imagine being on that sort of edge of possibility and sort of the expansiveness that might come with that. But tragedy strikes him just a year after he begins in the School of Art because his father dies.
He does. So he's orphaned.
Yeah. So he's orphaned, and it seems maybe he has a moment of, oh crap.
Yeah.
Is this art thing really going to be the thing that provides me with my life and security? Because perhaps he was anticipating sort of being supported by his dear father through his years in studying art school. So he does decide to try out the conventional career, doesn't he? And he joined the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank in 1906, but he clearly doesn't have a love for this kind of work.
To say the least, I would say. And I think early on shows something of his character too. He's a sensible and pragmatic man, but he can't bear it. To quote him, I found it utterly alien. He'd had a taste of life at the Slade School and couldn't bear it. So just after a year, he went back to the then London School of Art, which was a leading place, and I think very interesting. Not a painter well known in America, Frank Brangwyn, but a big figure in British art and a big figure actually in Europe. Amazingly, Frank Brangwyn was commissioned by Siegfried Bing to decorate his first gallery in Paris, which was the Galerie L'Art Nouveau, which gave the name to the Art Nouveau style. So Frank Brangwyn, big figure and open. But more than anything else, Brangwyn and some of his colleagues were into the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, that a painter, which he was, could practice the different arts and get involved in different practice. So the idea that you can open yourself up, I think, loosened Leach away from being quite a limited, say, painter or sculptor into thinking about art in a bigger way.
And we need to maybe remind our listeners that Gesamtkunstwerk is sort of the idea of the total work of art, or so that often applied to architectural spaces, right, where you curate the entire interior space. So this idea kind of applies to the study of multiple materials, not just kind of honing in on one area. And this is what Leach does. He studies painting, he studies etching, and that's where he really takes off the etching, printmaking. He starts out there not as a clay artist, interestingly enough, and by 1909 he's returned to Japan to teach etching.
Yeah, absolutely. So no clay in sight at this stage. You couldn't do it anyway.
It wasn't being offered.
It wasn't being offered, so it never occurred to him. But an open mind about different practice. What I think is also interesting, and Brangwyn as well, his mentor and teacher, was a painter, but made most of his income from printmaking. But Brangwyn went on and also designed ceramic slightly later. So I think this man was important for Leach. So he's a painter, but he's an etcher and a printmaker. And he thinks when he goes back to Japan, he can make a living teaching that.
Right.
And selling prints.
And he also, he isn't left completely destitute by the death of his father. He has a trust fund that gives him about £100 a year. And so that gives him a foundation so that he can be sort of pursuing other areas. He got himself a studio. He got connected up with the local scene. And shortly after he arrives back in Japan, he would get married to his first wife, Muriel, who was also his cousin, and that feels like a much different conversation. But they together had several children, and by 1911, and then again in 1913, his two sons, David and Michael, are born, and they are important because they're destined to become great potters as well as a part of this Leach empire that we're talking about.
They are, and just to remind ourselves, £100 would probably give you an early evening out in London. It wouldn't get you through the whole evening now. But £100 then came close to being enough to live for a year. In Japan, which was still not the expensive Japan we know.
Exactly. So we're in 1909. He's arrived in Japan. He gets married. He starts having a family. But I think it's important for us to talk a little bit about the context of Britain and Japan during this era.
The situation then, at that point in time, in Britain and Japan, an intellectual rebellion was taking place, or had been taking place for some time in Britain, with regard to how we approach the visual arts. Perhaps the single big driving force behind that was the arts and crafts movement, which has its first major exhibition in 1888. It's formed slightly before then. And there are major figures whom really, by the end of the century, were enormously influential all over Europe and certainly in the States as well. John Ruskin, the great critic and writer, and William Morris,
of course,
who I would say it's not fair to say he's a follower, but influenced by Ruskin. Ruskin's great works, 1850s, 1860s, and he dies around 1900 at the end of the century-ish. But Morris, very active, a writer, a poet, a political activist, and a practitioner of decorative arts.
Yes.
And promoting the idea that we could use the arts to push back the dark side of industrial culture and the dark side of what they call modern commercialism, by which they mean capitalism.
Right.
So it's a politicized pushback and an attempt to make the arts into something that can save society. So a very short quote from Ruskin, who's a beautiful writer on these matters, about if you're going to build giant factories and if you're going to make children work 10 and 12-hour days, you're going to destroy them. You're going to destroy what they do. And it became a major force. He says this: you must make a tool of the creature or a man of him. You cannot make both. Men were not made to be precise and perfect in all their actions. If you will have that precision out of them, you must unhumanize them. In other words, what we're doing to people is destroying society. And a very powerful thing. Now, there's an irony there, of course, because Britain was the first industrial nation who imposed it on everybody else and built a giant empire. But nevertheless, it always had, in its later years, that opposition that we're destroying everything.
Right. And so Morris, he proclaims this anti-industrial moral philosophy, arguing that not all of modern science and commerce could reproduce the beauty of a simple handmade object, right? He would write, have nothing in your houses that you do not know how to be useful or believe to be beautiful. So there's this element of beauty, of simplicity, of the handmade. And this is something that Leach absorbs quite powerfully. And he would say, my own function wherever I work is to bring standards of beauty back into the pots that we use without loss of their suitability for purpose.
Absolutely. So in many respects, looking through Leach's writings, and Leach also a beautiful writer, It shadows quite heavily John Ruskin and William Morris and the thinkers in the arts and crafts movement.
And at the same time, Japan was really undergoing its own massive shift culturally.
Yes, you bet. So we should just put a little bit of context. Japan was discovered and became hugely influential artistically from the mid-centuries. Essentially what happened is that by choice, Japan had closed itself off to the outside world right through to the mid-19th century. But by then, the Europeans and Americans wanted to open Japan up to trade and so forth. I mean, if we think about it, Korea and China had been heavily commercially invaded, not quite made part of any empire, but nevertheless under the control of the Western world. And Japan, it was their turn. In 1853, very famously, an American ship led by Commodore Perry forced the Japanese ports to open. And from that point onwards, Japan effectively coerced into starting to trade with the West and then embraced it. It's almost as though the Japanese realized that they could actually take up the ideas that were around in the West and control their own fate. And the Meiji period, the Meiji emperors come to power, and the Meiji period runs from about here through to the early 20th century. And we have an incredible transformation of Japan. It industrializes.
Right, it's industrialized. And so there was, of course, some sort of backlash against that by the Japanese themselves because they're searching for their own identity amidst this kind of Western influence, would you say?
Absolutely. Whenever you get white-hot heat of technology, as it's been called, when you get a technological surge, you always get its opposite. People saying, whoa, what are we losing here, and so forth. And that happened in Japan as well. What was also happening after the opening up is that Japanese art and culture started to flood into Europe and America. And the incredible quality of Japanese architecture, woodwork, printmaking, the wonderful woodblock prints, and ceramic started to move into Europe. And Japonisme, as it was called in France, Japonism in the UK, became incredibly influential by the 1880s and was everywhere. So again, Leach, enthralled by Japan, but didn't really introduce Japanese culture to anybody. We already knew about it, but pretty rare to go and live there. Pretty rare to go and live there. Now, that comes from his own birth, his own early years, that he had that sense of yearning for the East. It was almost part of his own growing up process. So he decides to take his expertise in etching, his new philosophy, his new outlook. He was also a painter, of course, and sets himself up in Japan with a view to teaching and trying to sell.
Right. And a similar thing is kind of happening, I would argue, with arts and crafts movement and the kind of the moral aspect of pushing back against industrialization. And there's a movement afoot in Japan which actively sort of tried to blend Western modern approaches with the idea of traditional Japanese craft values. And so he arrives and he sort of gets seated right directly within that.
You bet. The Shirakaba movement, which was quite heavily painters, but a range of the arts and crafts as well. So he landed back in an environment that's quite similar to the one he'd left.
Right. So it's sort of the arts and crafts movement of Japan almost.
I would say so.
Yeah? Is that fair to say that?
So. Yeah. And from that point of view, it's as well for us to remember now that from the European perspective, they thought from the 1850s onwards right through that somehow they were discovering this disappeared, undiscovered country, Japan, and it's pure and it's not been sullied by other things. The Japanese had already been looking what was going on. They totally knew what was going on, and they were weighing up what was happening in European art really from the 1860s onwards. So it's really to do with internationalism backwards and forwards rather than the Europeans discovering primitive Japan.
Right.
Japanese quite heavy, quite willing and to be whatever the Europeans want as long as they bought it.
Yeah.
So very clever commercially.
Yeah.
but a rich international environment that Bernard landed in.
With all of this, amid, I guess, all of this change and westernization, what would it have been like for Bernard, sort of on the streets of Japan?
Yeah.
Are Japanese and British colonists intermixing? Is it segregated? Is it, what would that experience have been like for him?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the Meiji period, the half century through to just before the First World War, it's a pretty traumatic time in Japan. It's industrializing at a speed that no other culture ever did before or since. If we think of China now at its highest speed, I think Japan was faster than that in that period, because there was a realization in government in Japan that if they didn't industrialize, they could go under. They could easily be overrun by other empires. So there's a period of transformation. And obviously, there's resistance to that transformation as well. There's, there was already a way of life, and many Japanese were keen to stay closed. They weren't necessarily desirous of becoming an international culture. So politically, a traumatic time.
So where does he land? Does he land in Tokyo? Where is he setting up? Is he in a small village? Is he in a city?
Largely in Tokyo to begin with, but the Japanese vernacular, folk art and folk life interests him enormously. But we would say for the average Japanese person, the quality of life could well have been getting better in simple material terms. Japan was beginning to enrich itself. So a period of dramatic change, and I would say quite a lot of confusion on the ground in Japan itself, but perhaps materially strengthening and slowly becoming the Japan we tend to think of now, of technologically very savvy, industrial, commercial, and an international culture. This is the moment that happens, and it carries the bulk of Japanese people with it. So Leach would have been in an international circle that was skeptical about all that, that was keen to push it back. He didn't like it in Britain, and he didn't like it in Japan. So his friendships and the artists he tends to mingle with and practitioners he mingles with have a sense of objecting to the way that Japan is modernizing, a modernization of Japanese culture. So a tense time, and if anything, more intense than its equivalent in Britain during the arts and crafts movement. It's a similar kind of pushing back this commercial, technological world and creating a space for a different philosophy. And Leach was in that pond, but it was a small pond compared to the whole of Japan, I would say.
So do you think he would have traveled around Japan to smaller villages? Was he developing a love of this culture?
Absolutely, he was, yeah. I mean, he was based in the city where the artists tended to be, but yes, he came to know Japanese culture, and his friends absolutely love the idea of the Japanese village, Japanese traditional life. It's a big component in what's going on here. And yes, he fell in love with this culture.
And so he's there teaching etching for a few years.
Yep.
But 1911 is this pivotal year where he attends a party that would change his life. And he didn't know what it was, presumably, before he attended, but it was a Raku party.
So he tells us that this was the big moment for discovering ceramic. And there's a wonderful large quote. We don't want to quote it all, but he tells us, and let's remember, he's a painter and an etcher.
Yeah.
Brushes and saucers of colour were lying about, and presently a number of unglazed pots were brought in, and we were invited to write or paint on them. I struggled with the unfamiliar paints and the queer long brushes, and then my 2 pots were taken from me and dipped in a tub of creamy white lead glaze.
That's right, because then he goes on to describe the kiln becoming bright red until the cover is removed from it and the glowing pieces were taken out one by one. He continues, the glow slowly faded and the true colors came out. Another 5 minutes passed, and we could be gingerly handling our pots, painted only 1 hour before. I was enthralled. on the spot, seized with the desire to take up this craft.
Now, whether it's completely true or not, it's a lovely story.
It is, at least in the U.S., you can go around to these paint-your-own pottery shops. I don't really know if those exist here in the U.K., but you go in and they're, pre-made bisque objects, and you paint on with your bright colors, and then, you go away and they fire them and you come back and pick them up. They do these for children's birthday parties, coworker retreats, any sort of thing. This sounds a bit like this to me, where they all show up, everybody decorates some pre-made pottery, go into a Raku kiln and come out. And if you've never experienced the Raku kiln firing, it is pretty miraculous. Like, you take an object, it gets put into a kiln, the gas is turned up really hot. These pots get really hot really quickly, and then
they go orange.
They go bright orange and red, and then with protective fired gear, the lid is lifted off, and you pop these pots into combustibles to have this reaction. So it is it's immediate in a medium that isn't typically immediate. So it is it's pretty fantastic.
So let's believe, Bernard, that it was that moment.
Yeah.
He'd probably seen beautiful ceramics around. He was in Japan.
Yeah.
But it's a big moment for him, and I think it probably did pull together a lot of threads. That is, painting, the surfaces, but also an art form that could belong to everybody, that was communal, traditional, and historic. He was very interested in what we broadly term the vernacular, that is, folk art and peasant art going back through the ages. It had that sense to it. So a penny probably dropped that this is an art form I could embrace. And his teachers back in England would have encouraged that had it, occurred over there. So it is a seminal moment, 1911.
So. Well, and I think the other part, the next step that he takes is to seek some training. And he doesn't just seek training with anyone.
Oh, no.
He seeks training with Kenzan the Sixth.
Yeah. So a Kenzan, going way back in Japanese history, is a grand master, in effect.
Yes.
And it's handed on to another one and another one.
Yeah.
So the first Kenzan, second Kenzan. This is the sixth Kenzan, Urano Shigekiki, who actually, his reputation in Japan as a great potter is not huge. He's probably best known now because he taught Bernard Leach, I would say. But nevertheless, a top person.
Right. And I would say that, the Kenzan title, it stems from the Edo period, and the original Kenzan was Ogato Kenzan. Right. And he trained apprentice and passed down his knowledge, and the next trained apprentice, and the next and the next. So now we are at the sixth, right? And so that is also a pretty powerful legacy, I would say. And so he's Leach's primary teacher.
Yeah. I would say also it's something to keep in our minds that comes up again and again and again through his career. Bernard Leach was a very persuasive character, and very evidently in terms of making contacts and finding people to help in his various enterprises, which is a very good thing for an artist to do. So entrepreneurial, but also good at landing in the right place and persuading and collaborating with people who can help. He spent his life doing that and helping his own pupils and apprentices as well. He also gets two lifelong friends in this period.
He does.
Which is important. Shōji Hamada, himself a great ceramic artist.
Yes.
The two of them bond and are very close. And Yanagi Suitsu. And Yanagi, one of the great philosophers of craft, who promotes the whole idea of tradition, skill through craft. And the three of them form a really tight bond through the rest of their lives.
They do. And I think we should just take a minute to just talk a little bit more about Hamada and Yanagi.
Absolutely.
Just that Shōji Hamada is a name that almost anyone in clay recognizes today. He, in 1955, was designated a national living treasure in Japan, which is the highest honor you can receive for the arts. And he, of course, was a Japanese potter And he really had a significant influence over the pottery of the 20th century. He's the major figure in what we call the Mingei movement. And he established the town of Mashiko as a pottery center even today. And Yanagi, he was the philosopher, he was the art historian, he was the poet of this group. And he developed this theory of why objects made by unknown craftsmen were so beautiful, and became the founding father of Mingei, which is the Japanese folk craft movement.
Yeah. So, in effect, we got John Ruskin and William Morris in Britain provided a philosophy and a way forward. I would say Hamada and Yanagi do the same in Japan with Leach, and they establish a way of seeing the arts generally, but especially ceramics.
Yeah, and I want to spend just a minute on this word Mingei because it's going to come up again, especially in our third episode. Mingei literally means arts of the people, and again, it was this movement to counteract the rapid industrialization of Japan and this westernization. It was a pushback, and so instead of elevating one of a kind fine arts created by really famous artists. This movement, similarly to the arts and crafts movement, elevated functional items such as ceramics, textiles, bowls, wooden furniture, these sort of daily use objects to the idea of being art.
Yeah, it's a beautiful idea. And one might add, many of us, I would include myself, one of the most wonderful thing about ceramic is that it goes through every tier of society. Kings love it, but actually nearly everybody has ceramic in their homes, and quite often really nice things. So it's the ultimate egalitarian art. It's not made out of gold, it's made out of mud. Albeit sophisticated mud, I would say, but we get the point that it has that spirit to it, which clearly that's deep in Leach's heart, and it comes from his Japanese friends also.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yanagi said this really lovely thing about Leach. Our spiritual appetites were the same. Our hope was his hope, and our agony was his agony. He probably got nearer to the heart of modern Japan than the ordinary Japanese did. It is doubtful whether any other visitor from the West ever shared our spiritual life so completely. That's from a leading cultural spokesperson for Japanese culture talking about Bernard Leach. And we shouldn't make light of that.
No, not at all. So I think by the end of the decade, we could say that Leach had totally transformed. He perhaps started out as a reluctant banker, turned art student, turned banker again, aspiring etcher. But he finds his true calling around the fires of a Raku kiln. And I think we can say by 1920, his ideas are settling into this kind of firm philosophical outlook. And his ceramic skills are maturing. And he makes a massive decision. He packs up, leaves his life in Japan. He's accompanied by his great friend Shōji Hamada, and he sets sail for the United Kingdom.
He does. So what we have then is a man who has splashed around so many different areas in life and found himself. What we should also note, and I think it is it's a big decision and a courageous decision, because by 1920, he was getting quite a reputation in Japan. He was beginning to do okay. He was teaching. He was selling etchings. He was a draftsman. One thing he learned in the British art schools, he could draw. And perhaps his decoration is one of his greatest achievements in future decades. So he's doing okay. He's got a family already. He decides to give all that up and risk going back to the UK to a far more competitive art environment. Pretty brave, I would say.
I think so. So they were headed to a small coastal town, St. Ives, to establish a pottery that I think would end up changing the world.
So another thing to remember is that whilst there's a lot of Japanese art and artifacts in the UK by then, there weren't a lot of Japanese people. It would have been very rare, and I would say very rare in St. Ives.
Especially in Cornwall.
Yeah. And perhaps we would say, this is a quote from Bernard himself on arrival. Genuine handicrafts of quality. It's difficult to find now in England, as it's been driven out by modern industry and applied science. In the Cornish picture, it's still possible to see something of the spirit of old English pottery. So there's a reason for going down there, I would say.
So I think that's going to be it for this part 1 today, and we're excited to dive into the rest of Bernard Leach's story over the next 2 episodes. Thanks so much for listening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
If you like what you've heard, leave us a comment or give us a follow wherever you get your podcasts, or go to henny.com/thehistoryofceramics.